Hello, my name's Peter Ballerstedt. The title of my talk is When is Protein Not Protein? And some related topics. For anyone who's not familiar with me, I am an advocate for therapeutic carbohydrate reduction in the human diet and ruminant animal agriculture. I've worked in forage agriculture for most of my adult life. And while I presently work for a forage seed company, I'm not speaking as a representative of that company today. Oh, and by the way, for anyone who's not familiar with hay judging, there is no taste test portion of the hay judging process. Apparently, Abraham Lincoln liked to tell folksy stories to make a point that his audience would then better understand. So here's one that I think has a lot of application to the realm of human nutrition today and to today's talk. So it goes something like this. A man asked a boy, "How many legs would your calf have if I called its tail a leg?" And the boy thought for a moment and then said, "5." And the man said, "No, calling the tail a leg would not make it a leg." Again, I think that this has a lot of application in the realm of human diet, nutrition, and health. But I can hear people rightly ask, "What do you know? You're just a forage agronomist." Well, over the last decade, as I've gotten the opportunity to learn from so many wonderful people that are researching or practicing within the realm of human nutrition and health, I keep realizing that I know things as a forage agronomist, as a ruminant nutritionist, that some of these people don't know, and that frankly surprises me. So for example, when we look at this nutrition label for potatoes and we see protein here at 3 grams, there are people who don't understand that as much as a quarter of that is in fact not protein. And when I've tried to explain this to some very intelligent people, I get looks kind of like this one. So I thought maybe it would be worthwhile exploring that. And then as I've explored this, I come to wonder how this information would impact on many, many other conversations that we have. And so that's what I hope to do today in this talk. My objectives are to explain the difference between crude protein and true protein, the current status of humanity's protein supply and future demand, what safe levels of dietary protein intake in the human diet might be, some methods of estimating protein quality in human nutrition and how they differ, and what the processing's effect on the digestibility of essential amino acids is and how that differs between plant source foods and animal source foods. And also taking a look briefly at the environmental footprint of protein production. Protein has probably the largest impact environmentally in terms of the production of protein for human nutrition, and that's whether it's plant or animal. But how we talk about protein surely should be part of that conversation. So those are my 6 objectives, and you could well be asking, why does all this matter? So what? Well, I think that this has direct application to consumers, also to research, also to modeling, and to policy questions. And by the end of this talk, I hope I make the case for all these. So first of all, crude protein is not the same as true protein. But when we look at a food label or a table of nutrient values for food, we will see a value that's called protein that is in fact crude protein. So if it's not true protein, what is it? It's actually the percent nitrogen in a sample multiplied by 6.25. We assume that all the nitrogen that was in that sample was in protein, and all of that protein was in fact 16% nitrogen. Now, this crude protein value is part of a practice of analyzing, characterizing feedstuffs that goes back into the late 1800s. And as you'll see as we go along, it's relatively easy to do compared to some other analyses. So we've done it for a long time. It's relatively easy to do. We've got a lot of data from a number of years and researchers, but it's not really the kind of information we need for human nutrition. And those assumptions, especially for monogastrics like humans or pigs, are pretty important to understand what the limitations are. So some proteins contain more or less than 16% nitrogen. Different foodstuffs contain varying amounts of what we call non-protein nitrogen. And when I said that a quarter of that protein in the potato is actually non-protein nitrogen, this is what I was referring to. So in other words, a quarter of the nitrogen that was multiplied by 6.25 to estimate its protein content, which was then listed on the table, in fact was not in protein. The difference between crude protein and true protein is greater in plant source foods than in animal source foods. And that true protein from animal source foods contains a higher proportion of the nutritionally essential amino acids than the plant source foods. Okay. Now, again, we look at varying other areas. So for example, global nutrition. And in this case, we can find FAO data showing the per capita daily protein supply. And we can look at the animal source food protein from 1961 and to 2013 for regions of the world: Africa, America, Asia, Europe, Oceania, which would be New Zealand and Australia, some other countries, as well as then for the world as a whole. And then they also list their data in a way that you can separate the animal source food from the plant source food. So the plant source protein is going to be the green bit on top of the bar. Now, good news here is that from, that half century, that from 1961 to 2013, the per capita daily protein supply has increased everywhere, and that's good. And it's especially good when we realize that the population has more than doubled. So we've made tremendous progress in that case. Despite the progress we've made, we do have a challenge that's coming at us, and that challenge is that by the next 30 years, it's projected that we're going to add another 2 billion people to the world population. That's going to necessitate a doubling of food production. It's also going to be accompanied by a 2/3 increase in demand for animal protein. And of course, we don't get really any more land to do that on. So that's the challenge. And again, now I'm going to come back to this data set that I showed previously. I'm going to only look at the 2013 data for clarity. And I'm also going to make the point that this is crude protein. This is not true protein. There's no correction here for the value of the plant source versus the animal source. We're just here looking at total grams of crude protein per person per day. And again, when we have people arguing that we're eating too much protein, the only way you can get there, it seems to me, is if you're looking at the RDA, the recommended daily allowance, which for a 70 kilogram individual would be about 56 grams of protein per day. Now, you can look at this and say, well, look, it does appear as if every region is exceeding that goal. But then you have to ask, what about RDA? Are there problems with that? Just like there are problems with confusing crude protein and true protein. And indeed, it turns out that RDA is not the target, it's a minimum. And in addition, it's assumed to be of reference protein, and reference protein itself is defined as highly digestible, high quality protein such as egg, meat, milk, or fish. So already now we're seeing a problem. In addition, it's been largely unchanged for almost 3/4 of a century, and recent studies, particularly in older people like myself, suggest that there are specific health benefits at levels of protein intake significantly in excess of RDA. So again, RDA is not the target. Coming back to this data again, we now have researchers suggesting that the current evidence indicates that intakes in the range of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day of high quality, again, protein is a more ideal target for achieving optimal health outcomes in adults. So this is data, this is evidence, and now when we look at those regions, we see that really only 3 of the regions get into that level of intake, and only when we count the plant source protein as equivalent, crude protein, as equivalent to the animal source crude protein. Okay, so keep that all in mind. And then we've got the same data, but we've now expanded the vertical scale because there is such a thing as this acceptable macronutrient distribution range, AMDR, for protein intake. And it's set at 10 to 35% of calories. That in itself is a problem because it really is inaccurate to talk about protein in the human diet in terms of percent of calories. Human beings need an amount of high quality protein every single day. They need specific amounts of the digestible, indispensable amino acids every single day. And how many calories you're consuming shouldn't affect that. But if you're talking in terms of percent of calories, of course it will. If you eat more or less and you're after a fixed target, then your amount of calories is going to vary. And we could talk about calories, and maybe I will in a later talk. But in any case, you start to see the tremendous range that would be acceptable even by the Institute of Medicine and the dietary guidelines, who accepts this kind of target range for intake. And in fact, there's even something called a tolerable upper limit to intake, which is as high as 3.5 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. So one of the things that we can say for protein in the diet is we have a tremendous window of safety for intake. And it's well beyond what the RDA would suggest it being if you confuse the RDA with a target instead of a minimum. And against all this, we have people who are recommending global levels of intake that are well below what's been established as being safe and essential for human health. So we could talk about that later, and maybe I best just leave that alone. But for those people who advocate for a global diet, or that humanity's diet ought to be plant-based, the evidence is it already is plant-based. I'm now focusing on the global crude protein supply for humans. And one of the things to say here is that the vast majority of protein, in quotes, in humanity's diet is from plant sources, not from animal sources. And in fact, more of humanity's crude protein is supplied by cereals than all animal source food combined. Maybe that's the problem, because we get a lot of other substances with cereals in addition to crude protein. We get starch, we get anti-nutrient components. We don't get things in cereals that we do get from animal source foods, like highly digestible micronutrients and vitamins. And so all of these now we need to keep in mind, we're not just eating protein when we eat food, we're eating many nutrients, and we'll get to that again here shortly. So if we begin to look more globally, we can come across statistics like this that say that for the poorest 20% of the tropical population around the world, rice provides more crude protein per person than beans, meat, or milk. Now, what's interesting here is in parts of the world, for example, in India, where people might be eating rice and lentils in an attempt to obtain the essential nutrition they need. One researcher has recently told me that even with an unrestricted diet of rice and lentils, an 8-year-old boy could only get about 45% of what he needs in terms of indispensable digestible amino acids, eating as much as he possibly can. So it's important for us to have this perspective of the quality as well as the quantity. And lest anyone think that this is something that only pertains to lower and middle income countries, here's data that was contained in the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. They were citing NHANES data, and their own data suggested that over 40% of Americans don't get enough protein, and that most females over the age of 8 don't get enough protein. And this is worse because, again, they're measuring against the RDA, and they're considering plant source protein and animal source protein, again, crude protein values. They're considering those as equivalent, and they're not. So this, and this again is one of those examples of calling a tail a leg, because somehow, despite citing this information, they went ahead and decided that protein was not a nutrient of concern in the American diet. So it's very interesting how they could get there even with the data that they cited. But in any case, as I say, but wait, there's more. It gets worse, because plant source foods are more variable in their nutrient content than are animal source foods. So for example, I am able to consult a database of almost 6,000 samples of crude protein, and that showed that the crude protein value varied plus or minus 20% around a mean value of 39%. And that the individual amino acids in that sample set could vary by as much as plus or minus 45%. So when soybeans' nutritive value is listed in a table and they use that 39% value, well, but that varies quite a bit as demonstrated by this data set. And when soybeans are used as an ingredient in a product and they then calculate what the product's food value is, that could vary quite a bit as reflected by these data. And we've known this for decades in animal science. That's why we go to the expense and effort to test every lot of hay, for example, or lots of grain that are purchased to be fed out in modern management systems, because we want to know what the value of that is. We'd like to know that before we buy it, so we have some sense of what its true value is. And I'm pretty sure that nobody's printing a new set of labels for every new batch of food or processed food product that's being created. So again, this is important because that number may not have much touch with reality. In addition, as I said, all of cereals provides more crude protein for humanity's diet than all animal source foods combined. It turns out that wheat is the largest single source of crude protein in humanity's diet. It's 20%. It's larger than any single animal source food, obviously, if it's the number one. And again, there's lots of market classes of wheat. And one of the characteristics of those market classes is protein content. And then there's management effects, then there's environmental effects. So you could easily have the crude protein content of wheat varying from 9 to 15%. So for more than 4 decades now, swine nutritionists have been balancing their rations on an essential amino acid content basis. And we're nowhere near doing that in the standard practice of human nutrition. And I would argue it's probably time that we do that, especially as we think about people in low and middle income countries that are on primarily cereal-based diets, or people in higher income countries that are primarily eating these highly processed foods. It's very difficult to know what in fact they're eating or able to get from those diet components. Again, humans don't digest protein, crude protein. They absorb amino acids. And there are these, we've traditionally spoken about amino acids as being essential or non-essential. A little while ago, we started to realize that no, in fact, some of those that we previously thought were non-essential could in fact become essential, depending on stage of life, environmental stresses, those sorts of things. Interestingly enough, even under periods of illness, we might find an increased need for some of these previously considered non-essential amino acids, and now we find that they are in fact essential. Well, I found this quote, which basically says that if you could artificially construct some diet that was completely lacking some previously considered non-essential amino acid, there's no evidence that we could make enough. We can make some, but there's no evidence apparently that we could make enough to make up for a complete lack in our diet. So again, these things become of increasing interest the more we rely on heavily processed manufactured foods, and especially as we eliminate or severely restrict animal source foods from the diet. Over the years, there's been varying ways to try to talk about protein quality in the human diet. Since 1991, they've used something called PDCAS, protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. Now, from the beginning and since, there were limitations in this methodology, but it was selected as the most practical one at the time. And those limitations turn out to be that it overestimates the value of plant source protein and underestimates the value of animal source protein. There's some other reasons for this overestimation, but it also, because of the understanding at the time, caps the value of any one food at 100. So all of the animal source foods that typically are above 100 in value just automatically get set to 100, which is part of how the plant source foods end up being overestimated and the animal source foods become underestimated. In addition, issues of bioavailability, anti-nutrient quality components, those aren't accounted for in this system. And by 2013, then the experts decided to move toward what's called digestible indispensable amino acid score. The acronym is DIAS. So key differences between DIAS and PDCAS. DIAS typically is going to be using pig ileal digestibility versus PDCAS, which used rat fecal digestibility. DIAS looks at individual amino acids, where PDCAS looks at crude protein. DIAS uses 3 scoring patterns from birth to 6 months, 6 months to 3 years, and 3 years and above. DIAS only uses 1 scoring pattern. And again, there's no truncation of values in the DIAS system. DIAS is determined by, first of all, determining the standardized ileal digestibility, which is abbreviated SID, of amino acids in the test food. And they're determined ideally in humans, but it's hard to find human volunteers who are ileal cannulated. Some volunteers do that, and that's wonderful, but a pig has been determined to be an appropriate model for this work. Lastly, a rat. Even worse would be to try to do some conversion factor from PDCAS, but there are reasons that we shouldn't do that. I won't get into it. So that value is then multiplied by the concentration of the same amino acids in a gram of the crude protein in that test food. And then that calculated milligrams of standardized ileal digestible amino acid per gram of crude protein is divided by the same amino acid requirement for a specific age group. And so from that, then, we obtain a calculated digestible indispensable amino acid reference value for each of the amino acids. And we can identify then the amino acid that's limiting, that's in the least concentration. Perhaps I shouldn't say limiting, because in an animal source food, for example, you'll still identify the amino acid in the least concentration, although it's well above the requirement. So why does any of this matter? Well, one of the reasons, it's used to regulate protein source claims in the marketplace. It's also used in balancing rations for human beings. I guess we call them diets. Sorry, my animal science nutrition is breaking through. But let's just take a look at this list of plant source foods, which commonly I think people would look at and say, oh yeah, those are good sources of protein. Well, even by DIAS, almonds, sunflower seeds, and peanut butter don't qualify to be called a good source of protein. And then when we go to DIAS and evaluate the same foods, only chickpeas would qualify for a good source of protein claim. So it's important to know this information if you're going to try to create a balanced diet, especially if you're eliminating or severely restricting animal source foods in the diet. As I said earlier, wheat is the #1 source of crude protein in humanity's diet, and it's a really poor quality protein source. So here we look at the DIAS values for wheat in the 3 categories: birth to 6 months, 6 months to 3 years, 3 years and above. And you can see that as human beings age, we get marginally better at utilizing it. Lysine is limiting in every case, but even for adults in this case, the value of that protein is less than half of what we could get from animal source foods, and including, we could feed this wheat to livestock and more than double its DIAS value. We'll get to that. But nobody really eats a diet of raw wheat berries. We process them into other foods. And when we do that, it turns out we dramatically decrease the value, so that whole wheat bread, for example, more than half decrease in the lysine, the digestible lysine that's available. And if we make a corn-based breakfast cereal, essentially none of that lysine remains as digestible and utilizable. And so now, if we combine that breakfast cereal with some whole milk, for example, now we can get the lysine that we need, but that's from milk, not some plant juice beverage milk replacer. And so again, as we create these diets that are more and more dependent on processed products, we need to have this information so that we can make informed decisions. What's interesting is that decrease in DIAS value doesn't occur when we process animal source foods. And in fact, it can actually increase them. So in this case, we take pork belly at 119 and we make bacon out of it. We increase its DIAS value to 142. And then you can look at the other products. So we have this evidence to show how we could take the animal source food and add it into a diet, and from that food add to the deficit or make up the lack that comes from the plant source foods that may or may not utilize in our diet. It seems to me the vast majority of human beings are going to be in the omnivore category. You could be a carnivore, you could be a vegan, or you're a omnivore, it seems to me. So if you're going to eat a varied diet, then how are you going to know how to create a diet that is going to provide the adequate essential nutrition that you require? And we've primarily been focusing here on protein or on amino acids, but it's clear, as I said earlier, we don't just eat protein or amino acids. And animal source foods are frankly superior to plant source foods as sources of all the essential nutrition that we require for proper development and health. So I understand that this may be a controversial subject for some, but there just is no objective argument about that. Sometimes I say if you can't get it from animal source foods, you don't need it. And I understand that that might open up a conversation on a couple topics, but maybe that's for later. Thinking globally, which I really want us to start doing more of. When we start looking at the low and middle income countries of the world, we have clear evidence of too little animal source food in the human diet, so that a quarter of children globally suffer from stunting, which is not just physical stature, it's mental development, cognitive ability, and it's a lifetime kind of decrement. It can't be overcome if we miss it at critical growth stages. 2 billion people in the world out of about 7.5 billion suffer from micronutrient malnutrition. And the best foods that they need to overcome that are animal source foods. May not take a lot, but it takes some. This is an issue of this journal, Animal Frontiers, from October of 2019. And the entire issue is focused on this idea of the essential nature of animal source foods in the human diet. So the title is Foods of Animal Origin, a Prescription for Global Health. And there's a series of papers in here, including one on DIAS. Again, I've been citing literature in the footer of these slides. At the end of this slide set will be a complete list of the references. And I encourage people to read these papers. One of my frustrations is while they're demonstrating the need for some and the clear evidence of the harm from too little, too many times we find in these kinds of papers reference to the harms from too much animal source food. And one of the things I'd very much like us to get beyond is the narrative of the health harm coming from too much animal source food in the diet. Frankly, when it comes to the consumption of animal source foods, there is such a thing as too little. And I challenge people to refute the question. Is there really such a thing as too much? I don't think so. I think that's all part of narrative and worldview and confounding from some poor quality evidence. And last October, we had a series of papers come out in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and this was the editorial. Adults can be reassured to continue to eat their current levels of red and processed meat unless they feel inclined to change them themselves. So in other words, there is no high quality evidence to support the recommendations to reduce. If there's a harm that comes from too much animal source food in the diet, it's not at current levels of intake, is my translation of this. And again, these researchers made the point that it's time to stop producing observational research in human nutrition. It's just not of the quality sufficient to base policy and recommendations to individual people's lives on. One of the specific papers was looking at this effect on heart and cancer outcomes, and they basically said that there's no good evidence from randomized trials to support the current guidelines and recommendations, which is quite remarkable. And then we can also find the reaction to those papers from people who are promoting an alternative viewpoint. And some of the text is quite interesting. That some of the researchers who actually reacted in a remarkable way to these papers, they've built their careers on nutritional epidemiology. I can understand it's upsetting when the limitations of your work are uncovered and discussed in the open, but isn't that what science is about? Isn't that what we should be doing? One of the particular researchers compared the articles, which he called a great debacle of public health, to information terrorism that can blow to smithereens the life work of innumerable careful scientists. Well, we should argue with that statement because of the quality of the evidence that they've built their reputations on and based recommendations on for the global population. Now, I've spoken a number of times on the role of ruminants and ruminant animal agriculture in global food systems and in global ecosystems. And there are a number of essential functions that ruminants perform. Tying into this topic, this conversion of, again, protein in quotes, which would include the non-protein nitrogen, which humans can't utilize, into highest quality animal protein. Excellent sources of protein per dias is a critical function, and there is no satisfactory substitute. And because of this, we can say with certainty that ruminant animal agriculture increases the quality and quantity of humanity's protein supply. They don't represent a competition for humans' food supply. They represent an essential upcycler, the essential source of this essential nutrition that in fact increases our food supply. And again, ruminant animal agriculture in particular, but all livestock agriculture, is essential to sustainable food systems. They're essential to human health and well-being. They're essential to sustainable development. In addition to this upcycling that I just discussed, they're a significant source of income for people around the world, and food security for people around the world, and a significant source of new wealth generation globally. Interestingly enough, and little recognized, more than half of the global fertilizer that's necessary to produce the crops that are produced are coming from livestock manure. And a significant portion of that comes from ruminant animals. In addition to that, over half of the world's farmers still depend on livestock for draft energy, pulling plows or wagons or what have you. Significant portion of those are ruminants, oxen, similar animals. The ecosystem services that are provided by ruminants, in addition, the management, the maintenance of the health of our grasslands, providing ecosystem services in terms of improved watershed health, improved infiltration, so reduced runoff, better water holding capacity in the soil, food resources for wildlife, all a fire abatement by consuming the grass that grows on these natural ecosystems. And again, there's no suitable substitute for grazing animals in these systems. And frankly, for fuel, we live in a world where 3 billion humans are still dependent on burning dirty biofuels, which would include, in many cases, dung. And not only do you have the health effects that come from that kind of dirty fuel in a confined space, but you do also lose the fertility in that manure. So that's less fertilizer available to put back into the fields for growing crops. So again, cattle thus contribute directly to global food security. The environmental footprint, once we take all these factors, including the digestible, indispensable amino acid scores, that environmental footprint of producing animal versus vegetal protein actually becomes far smaller. And then the notion that raising livestock and consuming animal source food is fundamentally incompatible with sustainable development is flawed. In fact, it's essential. That level of stunting that we've documented in sub-Saharan Africa is projected to be an 11% of GDP drag on their economic development potential. There's another environmental factor that hasn't really been factored into a lot of the models and conversations, and that is, what is the footprint of the pharmaceutical industry? What's the footprint of the chronic disease epidemic that we're currently experiencing in, it's not just the high-income countries, it's a global issue. The non-communicable diseases are the biggest killers globally, by far. And most of those non-communicable diseases are plausibly linked to some form of metabolic ill health. So if we were, for example, to take the average type 2 diabetic, and if we could restore their health through an effective lifestyle intervention and get them to be drug-free, we could reduce their carbon footprint 29% more than if we shifted them from a meat-heavy to a vegan diet. And frequently I'm speaking to audiences who already are aware of many studies and clinical practices where that in fact is being done. And so I kind of made the joke about, gee, if there were only some way. And then I realized that everyone who watches this may not be aware of the reality of drug-free remission of type 2 diabetes. And so we need to get this message out as well and say, when every 7 seconds someone in the world dies of diabetes, and every 30 seconds someone in the world loses a lower leg due to diabetes, and imagine the impact on that individual when that happens in a lower middle income country. Every day in the United States, 200 people have some part of their body amputated because of diabetes. It's a massive problem and ties directly into what kinds of foods should they be eating, how would they know how to monitor their metabolic health, how would they know how to formulate a diet which would provide adequate essential nutrition, when that information that I've already provided on how most of what they're told about protein really isn't protein. And again, that's not the only one that I could talk about, but it's the one that was the focus for this topic. So as we wrap this up, thinking about all those issues together, it plays in all those areas. And so I say that a steak a day keeps the doctor away. So a steak a day keeps the doctor away. But if you're going to be an omnivore, but restrict red meat, so you're not going to eat pork or mutton or lamb or goat or venison or beef, you're still going to eat the eggs, the poultry, the dairy, the fish and shellfish that are also animal source foods and will provide the adequate essential nutrition that you need that cannot be provided from a plant source food only diet. So my objectives, the difference between crude protein and true protein, they're not equivalent. Crude protein is what you will see listed on a label or in a table, but it's not adequate measure of the nutrition that we need for human diets. Current status of humanity's protein supply is that it's already plant-based. And if we were to take all of the animal source food protein that is consumed by the high income countries and give it all to the low and middle income countries today, we could not get them to the level that the FAO is predicting will be the target for 2016 or 2015. So we have to increase the productivity and efficiency of animal agriculture globally, and ruminant animal agriculture must be a significant part of those food systems. Safe levels of dietary protein intake are tremendous in their range. Basically at least 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And I've heard people ask, well, shouldn't it be lean body weight? My response is, how would you know what your lean body weight is? Now, some of us, we might have that information, but most consumers won't. And it's safe enough that we can just tell people, you know, divide your weight by 2.2 and multiply that by 1.2, and that's the grams of high quality protein that you need per day. Methods of protein quality estimation, PDCAS is what's been used, but watch for a shift to DIAS over time. It gives us more information. It will be more useful as we go forward. When we process plant source foods, we dramatically decrease the digestibility of those essential amino acids that they do contain. And in some cases, we can virtually eliminate them as far as being available to us in our diet. So that could become a serious consideration as we look at diets that are more and more based on these processed plant products. Again, the footprint of this protein production, when we compare animal source food to plant source food, it dramatically overestimates the animal source food footprint because we haven't been talking about protein properly, as well as some other reasons. Why does this matter? Well, how would the customer know? You know, they have a label. What does that label mean? It's so variable. It's really quite remarkable from my perspective in animal science and animal nutrition, how that number truly might just be meaningless. And, you know, we're going to tell people how, you know, they should track their macros. Well, how do they know how much actual protein they're actually eating? And again, talking about protein consumption in terms of percent calories is inappropriate. Research, what did they measure when people come up with these various studies where they look at protein? Were they just measuring crude protein and reporting that? In many cases, yes, because a lot of this work was done prior to 2013. So a lot of this work precedes the more accurate estimation of amino acid digestibility. What are they predicting in their models? Again, so much of this is based on current knowledge, and then they're looking to the future, but they don't really know the things that they don't know. And there's a lot of uncertainty. And again, if all they're doing is looking at pounds of crude protein rather than pounds of digestible essential amino acids, how useful is it? And again, driving policy, both domestic, international. This is information that's been known for a while. Why isn't it showing up in policy? We could probably come up with some reasons, but I'll just leave it there. So hopefully by this point, you understand what Abe was talking about. Calling a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. Calling it protein doesn't make it true protein, let alone the essential amino acids that we require in our diet, and how those will differ between true protein from plant source foods and true protein from animal source foods. So these are places you can find me. If you found this talk, you're probably already introduced to me on social media, but I'm happy to correspond, and I will have these slides available for anyone who wants to look into them more. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your support, and I wish you all good health. Thank you.